On a quiet Sunday morning in the early 1940s, the sound of sizzling bacon drifted through millions of American kitchens. It was a familiar sound, comforting, ordinary, almost invisible in its repetition. Yet, once the skillet was lifted and breakfast plates were filled, something unusual happened. Instead of pouring the leftover grease down the sink, families carefully tipped it into tin cans, jars, or coffee tins set aside for a very specific purpose. This simple, slightly messy ritual was not born out of thrift alone. It was an act of patriotism. During the Second World War, the American home front became an extension of the battlefield. Factories roared day and night, farms stretched their output to the limit, and citizens were asked, sometimes firmly, sometimes gently, to alter their daily habits for the sake of victory. Among requests to ration sugar, rubber, gasoline and meat, one appeal stood out for its oddity: save your cooking grease. To modern eyes, the idea seems almost comical. Why would a global military effort depend on yesterday's bacon fat? But at the time, the request made perfect sense. Cooking grease, particularly animal fats like lard and drippings, was a crucial raw material in the production of glycerin. Glycerin, in turn, was an essential component in making explosives, including dynamite and gunpowder. Without it, bombs would not detonate, shells would not fire, and weapons would fall silent. The war strained global supply chains to their breaking point. Imports that once flowed freely across oceans were now threatened by enemy submarines. Materials that had seemed abundant suddenly became scarce. The government faced a stark reality: to keep soldiers supplied, it needed to find resources at home, and American kitchens, it turned out, were full of untapped potential. Posters began to appear in grocery stores, post offices, and schools. They showed smiling housewives holding cans of grease, or soldiers marching forward thanks to the contributions made back home. The message was clear and repeated often: save waste fats for explosives. It was blunt, a little unsettling, and incredibly effective. Even children learned that the grease left behind after frying potatoes or meatballs had value beyond taste. Teachers explained it in classrooms, radio hosts mentioned it between songs, and newspapers printed reminders alongside war updates. For many women who were overwhelmingly responsible for cooking at the time, saving grease became a small but meaningful way to participate in the war effort. Not everyone could enlist, work in a factory, or buy war bonds, but almost everyone cooked. Each spoonful of grease scraped into a jar felt like a contribution, however modest, to something much larger than the household. It transformed domestic routine into national service. The process itself was simple but required discipline. Grease had to be strained, cooled, and stored properly to avoid spoilage. Once enough was collected, it could be dropped off at a local butcher or designated collection point. In return, families often received ration points or small credits, reinforcing the idea that nothing, absolutely nothing, should go to waste. To understand why cooking grease became so vital, one must look at the chemistry of warfare. Glycerin, chemically known as glycerol, serves as a foundation for nitroglycerin, the explosive compound discovered in the mid-19th century. When combined with other substances and stabilized, nitroglycerin becomes dynamite. Further refinements led to smokeless powder and other propellants used in artillery shells, bullets, and bombs. Before the war, much of the glycerin used in American munitions came from imported sources or was derived from commercial soap production. But wartime disrupted those channels. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels carrying vital cargo. Trade routes to Southeast Asia, where coconut and palm oils were plentiful, were cut off by Japanese expansion. Suddenly, the steady flow of raw materials became a trickle. American chemists and engineers scrambled to find alternatives. They discovered that animal fats, which had always been plentiful in the United States, could be processed to extract glycerin. The fat had to be rendered, purified, and chemically treated, but the underlying resource was everywhere: in butcher shops, slaughterhouses, restaurants, and home kitchens. The realization was both ingenious and humbling. America's war machine, with all its technological sophistication, needed something as humble as bacon grease to function. There were moments of frustration, of course. Kitchens already felt constrained by rationing. Butter was scarce, meat was limited, and recipes had to be reinvented with substitutes that never quite tasted the same. Saving grease added another layer of responsibility. Jars cluttered countertops, the smell lingered, and yet compliance remained remarkably high. The war gave inconvenience a purpose, and purpose has a way of smoothing rough edges. Women's magazines published tips on how to manage grease collection efficiently. Some suggested keeping multiple containers, one for clean bacon drippings suitable for reuse in cooking, another for mixed fats destined for the collection center. Housewives learned to strain out food particles, which could cause rancidity, and to seal containers tightly to prevent odors from spreading through the kitchen. Children were often enlisted to help. Youngsters carried small jars to school, where teachers weighed contributions and tracked totals on classroom charts. Some schools held competitions to see which grade could collect the most grease in a month. The winners received certificates or small prizes, but more importantly, they earned recognition for their patriotism. In neighborhoods across the country, collection became a communal activity. Neighbors reminded each other to save grease, shared tips on storage, and walked together to drop off points. Butchers, who served as collection agents, sometimes displayed running totals in their shop windows, turning the effort into a source of local pride. What made the grease-saving campaign particularly powerful was its symbolism. It told Americans that victory depended not only on generals and soldiers, but on everyday choices made at home. It blurred the line between civilian and combatant. A skillet, a stove, and a jar became tools of war, just as surely as rifles and tanks. There was also a subtle moral lesson embedded in the request. Waste, once considered merely careless, was now unpatriotic. Throwing grease away meant throwing away potential ammunition. Conservation became a civic duty. This mindset extended beyond fats to scraps, metal, paper, and clothing. The war reshaped how Americans thought about resources, instilling habits that would linger long after peace returned. The propaganda was carefully crafted to make the connection visceral. One poster showed a housewife pouring grease into a can, with the caption, "Mrs. Jones, your bacon drippings are needed in the fight." Another depicted soldiers in combat, with the message, "Fats make ammunition, save them for our boys." The imagery was direct, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Radio programs reinforced the message during prime listening hours. Popular shows included brief public service announcements reminding listeners to save their cooking fats. Celebrities and radio personalities endorsed the campaign, lending it glamour and urgency. Even comedy programs found ways to work grease saving into sketches, normalizing the practice through humor. Newspapers ran stories about the quantities collected and their impact on the war effort. Articles explained how many pounds of grease were needed to produce a single shell or bomb, making the abstract concrete. Readers could imagine their personal contributions accumulating into something significant. As the conflict dragged on, stories circulated about how much grease had been collected and how many explosives it could produce. These numbers, whether precise or embellished, fueled a sense of collective accomplishment. People liked to imagine that the grease from their breakfast had traveled across the country, been refined in a factory, and ultimately played a role in a distant battle. It made the vastness of war feel strangely personal. By some estimates, American households contributed millions of pounds of cooking grease annually during the war years. The exact figures varied, and record-keeping was not always rigorous, but the scale of participation was undeniable. In 1943 alone, it was reported that civilians turned in enough fat to produce glycerin for tens of millions of rounds of ammunition. The processing of collected grease was an industrial undertaking. Rendering plants received shipments from collection centers and subjected the raw material to intense heat and chemical treatment. Impurities were removed, and the purified fat was broken down through a process called saponification, which separated out glycerin. This glycerin was then further refined and sent to munitions factories. The entire supply chain, from kitchen jar to battlefield, represented a remarkable feat of coordination. It required cooperation among government agencies, private industry, transportation networks, and millions of individual households. The fact that it worked at all was a testament to wartime organization and public willingness to participate. The grease-saving campaign did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader culture of sacrifice and rationing that defined the home front experience. Americans were asked to limit their consumption of sugar, coffee, meat, butter, gasoline, and rubber. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and vacant lots, reducing demand for commercially grown produce. Scrap metal drives collected everything from old appliances to discarded cookware. Each of these efforts carried its own logic, but together they created a powerful narrative that every American, regardless of age, gender, or occupation, had a role to play in winning the war. The cumulative effect was to make the conflict feel immediate and personal, even for those thousands of miles from the fighting. Saving grease fit seamlessly into this framework. It required minimal effort, but constant attention. It was visible, measurable, and tangible. A jar of grease sitting on the counter was a daily reminder of the war and one's contribution to it. Unlike abstract concepts like industrial output or troop movements, grease was something people could see, smell, and touch. The campaign also reinforced traditional gender roles while subtly expanding them. Women, who did most of the cooking, were positioned as guardians of the home front. Their work in the kitchen, often undervalued in peacetime, was elevated to a matter of national importance. At the same time, this recognition came with expectations. Women were not just feeding their families, they were supporting the troops. Failure to save Greece was framed as a failure of duty. Yet there was also a sense of empowerment. For many women, the war opened up opportunities to work in factories, serve in auxiliary military roles, or take on responsibilities previously reserved for men. Saving Greece, humble as it was, became part of a larger story of female contribution to the war effort. Not everyone embraced the Greece-saving campaign with enthusiasm. Some people found it inconvenient, unpleasant, or ineffective. Skeptics questioned whether the collected grease actually made a difference, or whether it was simply a public relations effort to maintain morale. There were practical challenges as well. Grease had to be kept clean and free of contaminants, which was not always easy in busy households. Spoiled or rancid fat was useless for glycerin production. Some families lacked suitable containers for storage, while others forgot to drop off their collections regularly. In urban areas, where butcher shops and collection points were plentiful, participation was generally high. But in rural regions, where distances were greater and transportation more limited, collection could be sporadic. Some farming families, who already rendered lard for their own use, saw little point in saving additional grease for government programs. Despite these obstacles, the overall participation rate remained impressive. The combination of patriotic appeal, social pressure, and small financial incentives was enough to keep most people engaged. Even those who grumbled about the hassle generally complied, if only to avoid appearing unpatriotic. When the war finally ended, the need for saved cooking grease faded away. The posters came down, collection programs stopped. Kitchens slowly returned to old habits. Some jars were forgotten at the back of pantries, their contents solid and yellowed with time. Yet the memory of the practice endured, passed down in stories told by parents and grandparents, who remembered when even the humblest leftovers mattered. For a generation of Americans, the war years left an indelible mark. The habits of frugality and conservation learned during that time did not disappear overnight. Many people continued to save grease out of habit, even when there was no longer a national need for it. Others found new uses for it, from seasoning cast iron pans to making homemade soap. The campaign also left a legacy in how Americans thought about waste and resources. The idea that everyday materials could have hidden value, that nothing should be discarded carelessly, became part of the cultural consciousness. This mindset influenced post-war attitudes toward consumption and recycling, though it would take decades for those ideas to fully mature into modern environmental movements. Today, the idea of saving grease for explosives feels like a relic from another world. Modern supply chains, industrial chemistry, and changing lifestyles have pushed such practices into history books. Synthetic alternatives to animal-derived glycerin have largely replaced the need for cooking fats in munitions production. Global trade, despite occasional disruptions, has restored access to a wide variety of raw materials. But the story remains powerful because it captures something essential about that era: the belief that ordinary people, through small and sometimes strange sacrifices, could influence the course of history. It also raises questions about the relationship between citizens and the state during times of crisis. The grease-saving campaign was in many ways a form of mass mobilization. It asked people to alter their behavior, not for immediate personal benefit, but for a collective goal. It relied on trust. Trust that the government was using collected materials wisely. Trust that individual contributions mattered. Trust that sacrifice would lead to victory. That trust was not automatic. It had to be earned and maintained through effective communication, visible results, and a sense of shared purpose. The success of the grease-saving campaign and of the broader homefront mobilization depended on the government's ability to connect grand strategic goals with the minutiae of daily life. In retrospect, the campaign also reveals the improvisational nature of wartime planning. The need for household grease was not anticipated at the start of the conflict. It emerged as supply chains broke down and traditional sources became unavailable. The government's response to turn to the citizenry for help was both pragmatic and idealistic. It acknowledged limitations while empowering people to be part of the solution. There are echoes of the grease-saving campaign in contemporary efforts to address large-scale challenges. Whether it is climate change, pandemic response, or resource scarcity, the principle remains the same: individual actions multiplied across millions of people can have significant collective impact. Modern recycling programs, for example, ask citizens to sort their waste and set aside materials for reprocessing. The logic is similar to the wartime grease collection, turning household byproducts into valuable resources. The difference is that recycling is often framed in environmental rather than patriotic terms, and participation is sometimes inconsistent. Energy conservation campaigns encourage people to adjust thermostats, turn off lights, and reduce consumption. Again, the appeal is to collective responsibility and long-term benefit. But without the urgency of war, these campaigns often struggle to achieve the same level of engagement. The grease-saving story suggests that successful mobilization requires more than rational arguments. It needs emotional resonance, clear goals, and visible results. People are more likely to change their behavior when they feel connected to a larger purpose, when they see their contributions recognized, and when they trust that their efforts will make a difference. It also highlights the power of simple, concrete actions. Saving grease was easy to understand and easy to do. It did not require specialized knowledge or equipment. Almost anyone could participate, which made it inclusive and democratic. Complex challenges often benefit from being broken down into manageable tasks that people can incorporate into their daily routines. In the end, the request to save cooking grease was about more than materials. It was about unity, shared responsibility, and the quiet strength of collective effort. It turned the simple act of cooking into a reminder that wars are not fought only on distant fronts but also in kitchens, hearts, and daily decisions. And for a time, in homes across America, victory smelled faintly of bacon. The individuals who participated in the grease-saving campaign rarely saw themselves as historical actors. They were simply doing what was asked of them, making small adjustments to help win the war. Yet their collective actions had real consequences. The glycerin derived from saved cooking fats contributed to the production of munitions that shaped the outcome of battles. This is one of the paradoxes of history. Profound changes often result from the accumulation of mundane choices. Grand narratives of war and politics rest on foundations built by ordinary people doing ordinary things. The housewife scraping grease into a jar, the child carrying it to school, the butcher collecting and shipping it, all were participants in a vast interconnected system that spanned continents and determined the fate of nations. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were typical. They represent the lived experience of wartime, the texture of daily life under conditions of crisis and uncertainty. They remind us that history is not just made by generals and presidents, but by everyone. The grease-saving campaign also offers a window into the cultural values of the 1940s. It reveals a society willing to endure inconvenience for a common cause, a population that accepted government directives with relatively little resistance, and a media landscape that amplified official messages without much skepticism. These characteristics were products of their time. The Great Depression had taught many Americans the value of frugality and mutual aid. The attack on Pearl Harbor created a sense of existential threat that unified the nation in ways that are hard to imagine today. The relative lack of media fragmentation meant that government campaigns could reach broad audiences through a handful of channels. None of this is to romanticize the era. The home front was not uniformly harmonious. There were tensions over rationing, black markets, labor disputes, and civil liberties. The experience of war was shaped by race, class, and geography in ways that created deep inequalities. But the grease-saving campaign, with all its quirks and contradictions, remains a compelling example of what can happen when a society mobilizes around a shared goal. Decades later, the image of a housewife saving bacon grease for the war effort has become iconic. It appears in museums, documentaries, and historical exhibits as a symbol of home front sacrifice. Vintage posters from the campaign are now collectibles, their bold graphics and earnest slogans evoking a bygone era. Yet the real significance of the campaign lies not in its imagery, but in what it represented: the idea that even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant actions can contribute to something larger. In a world that often feels fragmented and overwhelming, where individual agency seems dwarfed by massive impersonal forces, the grease-saving story offers a different perspective. It suggests that participation matters, that collective action is possible, and that the boundary between public and private life is more porous than we sometimes assume. The kitchen, that most domestic of spaces, became a site of political and military consequence. The grease jar, a mundane household item, became a symbol of national purpose. This is why the story endures. It speaks to fundamental questions about citizenship, responsibility, and the relationship between individual and society. It asks what we owe to each other, what we are willing to sacrifice for the common good, and how we make meaning out of ordinary life. And it reminds us that history is not only written in battlefields and boardrooms, but also in kitchens where the smell of frying bacon once carried the weight of a nation at war.